So, in terms of US influence in the region, there are reports of AFRICOM expanding there, although they were expelled from Niger, for example, in September 2024. So, could you clarify the dynamics at play here? Can we expect the empire to strike back? And what can progressive forces do across the world to oppose Western interference in the region and build a solidarity movement?
I'm really glad you asked that question because yes, the empire definitely is already in moving to strike back. And you can see like France, for instance, is now kind of shifting their whole sort of way of acting and basically saying like we want to have kind of a smaller footprint, basically so it doesn't look as bad. And so they're looking for new partners and they're mainly looking now, I think, at Anglophone countries to be some of these partners, although some of the Francophone countries will stay with them. But you can see they're talking more with Kenya, may actually host the Africa France summit. And I think 2027, maybe 2026, they're looking at Nigeria, where they've been doing military drills with the military there and then the potentiality of being there. But France is basically saying what we want to do is reduce our military presence, shift it around a little bit so that it's in places that are more friendly to us and maybe a little bit more out of the way, but that we want to increase the ideological offensive against Pan-Africanism. And, in France, they have something called the School of Economic Warfare, which is one of those French, I don't speak French, but what do they call them? Écoles. It's one of the like top schools there for the military and for the government rather. And so they basically train people in like how to wage economic warfare, right? You think about hybrid wars. So they obviously have the military academies for like the actual soldiers, but then they also have this like, how do we undermine countries in different ways? And they've already put out a white paper that was like almost book length that essentially is saying that the real challenge is that there is a growing, radical, really anti-neocolonial, but anti-imperialist Pan-African movement. And it's, many different shades. Some of them are socialists and communists. Some of them are just people who want more sovereignty, but that people, whatever their ideological predilection exactly may be, are growing increasingly united around more sovereignty, less neocolonialism, and a strong anti-imperial stance for African countries. And that the most important thing is to create a stronger ideological front against that. And you can see on multiple levels, that they go out of their way in France to try to cultivate this on multiple different fronts. You can look at the United States with AFRICOM. The United States has always kept kind of a lower profile on the African continent in the past, like, let's say 20 years in many different ways, principally just because US military presence is so, like, people know what that means to such a degree, and they're aware that Africans are very conscious about colonialism and neocolonialism. So, the US, I think, has always been a little worried. AFRICOM was never able to even establish a headquarters in Africa. Not that they weren't working there, but like no country wanted to be known as the place with the US military because it's just so clear what that represents. So, they have like the drone base in Niger, but it was in the middle of nowhere and it was secret. And it was only when Nick Turse, writing at The Intercept, revealed it by actually looking at data from people's fitness watches. So, just remember, you're always being watched by all these things that you have. Then it became known, but like people didn't know. It was only because of the work done by individuals with Pan-African TV, the Socialist Movement of Ghana and others in Ghana, who were able to find out that the US has this like private airport terminal in Ghana where you can come and go from the country without going through customs. Like people didn't really know about that. In Zambia, progressive forces like the Socialist Party of Zambia, who've been able to reveal more that Zambia is becoming more of a base. But they've been trying to keep it a little bit under wraps already. And so that's still the continuation. But I say all that just to say that you can see the kind of creeping militarization that's happening. They're doing more drills with Zambia. They have this justified accord exercise in East Africa, Horn of Africa, that happens every year. Kenya is going to be a big host. That was when Ruto went to DC and they became a major non-NATO ally. That was one of the things they agreed on. But like one element of this, and believe it or not, guys, the military never responded to me when I reached out to them about this. But one of the last justified accord exercises, one of the areas they were doing it in, because it's multiple countries, was Somaliland. It's not a country, but they claim to be a country. It's the northern part of Somalia. And Somaliland, since it wants to be recognized as a country, has been saying to the US and the UK, you should put a military base here. You should recognize us and we'll host a military base. And we're better than Djibouti because Djibouti has a Chinese base. And you can't trust them because if you're working with China, they can't be trusted. So you want to be in Somaliland. So they're already doing sort of secret basing, the US and the UK, over there in Somaliland. They've obviously got a big base in Djibouti, Camp Lemonnier. They're looking to do various different factors in various different ways to sort of manipulate this. You can see they're trying to cultivate Angola as an ally now, traditionally one of the more independent independent countries in Africa in many different ways. They already have traditional security relationships with many others. So you can see that there's a shifting sands happening in terms of the military. The AFRICOM and now the Central Command, which is the one that is basically West Asia, are now working very closely together. I think AFRICOM is now like officially under Central Command. And in a way, it made it look like they were drawing back AFRICOM. But what it really means is it actually brings even more troops into AFRICOM, because it means that the broader sort of US presence in Europe and in West Asia is now also going to be heavily focused on Africa. You know, the EU is making some other interesting moves. Like when Chad got rid of the French, interesting to note who they brought in. They didn't bring in Russia, like Mali and Burkina Faso and others. They brought in Hungary and they brought in Turkey, two NATO countries. So like what, you know, gives you a sense of what that's about. Looks better than France, but same basic agenda. And Hungary actually has been talking a lot about this. That's maybe something we could talk about later, the far right in Europe and how they're relating to these changes in Africa, which is notable. But I say all that to say that militarily, they're shifting their posture, but they're actually in some ways strengthening it and also trying to make it even more subterranean. But those military relationships are how they really build ties on the continent, because they basically say to these regimes, we'll give you money and guns and weapons and our own military to suppress your own people and keep you in power. So that's happening. And at the French level, there's a major increase in terms of sort of quote unquote soft power. At the American level, the same thing is also happening. You've got these things like the Mandela Scholars set up under Obama, which is designed to create, you know, friendly African leaders. The National Endowment for Democracy, which is, you know, as they themselves have said, we do what the CIA used to do, you know, become a major funder of media in Africa. And this is like popping up all over the continent, these like independent media. And, you know, so it's Western trained mainly, but sometimes African trained people who want to be journalists, who want to do the news, but, you know, need funds and resources. They're cultivating those people and helping them put all sorts of independent media out there. A lot of interesting work has been done on that by Roscoe Palm. Some of that you can see at Monthly Review. Very interesting. You know, in South Africa, the US Embassy has a monthly off the record meeting called On the Rocks, where they bring all the editors of all the top media to a bar, and it's an open bar, and you just have drinks and talk. You know, we're just hanging out. Nothing nefarious, of course, going on there. They're just hanging out. But you can see the soft power level is increasing as well. So, you know, I think that there's a lot of fear about this in the imperial capitals. I think it's bigger in Europe than it is in America. America has a lot of trade with Africa, but it's not that much. Africa's main trading partners are the EU and China, really, and then Asia more broadly. And the US does do trade with them, but it's not as significant. So the US role is more about helping Europe maintain its role. In addition to, yes, the US has its own interests, but you could even see in Niger, the US actually tried to play France, and France was complaining about that, because as soon as they were like, we're kicking out France, America starts sending all these delegations, and they're like, hey, we want to stay. If you want to kick out France, cool with us. Now, it ended up not working because America was so arrogant. The Nigerian military was like, okay, well, if you want to stay, you got to play by our rules. And they're like, well, we're not going to do that. So like, you got to go. But you could see they were even trying to get over a little bit on France, you know, in that regard. So for Europe, it's more of an existential crisis, what's happening in Africa. For America, I think it's negative and it's not good for imperialism. But I think they're hoping they might be able to massage it a little bit more, and they can be a little bit more pliable than I think Europe can be in terms of trying to counter China, especially on the African continent. So anyway, long story short, I think people around the world have to just be very much in solidarity with what is happening in the Sahel. There's contradictions for sure. There's always contradictions. But ultimately, what's happening in the Sahel is of critical importance, because the Sahel is breaking free of neocolonialism in a way that is profound and I think real. And whatever the contradictions may be, it's the first kind of break in the dam in a major way on the continent in this century to start to change the trajectory away from Africa being totally impoverished. I think people have to be very much on the lookout about demonization. You know, Eritrea, Zimbabwe, countries like that have stood up to the West and that have pursued their own developmental course with much more success than they are given in the mainstream media, you know, continue to be under attack and under sanctions and lied about. And I think that people who care about lifting Africa out of poverty, opposing imperialism and neocolonialism, have to stand with those countries as well. And I think the mass movements that are happening in other places under the guise of Pan-Africanism, you know, need more solidarity, need more support, need more amplification all around the world, because, you know, they're fighting fighting under very, very difficult, challenging circumstances, as it were. But I think regardless of all the various contradictions, I think the forces who can stand with this broad trajectory, it's critically important that we do this, especially in the global north, because that's, who the main enemy is for the African people.